I'm originally from New York, and I did my undergraduate in New York at Bard College in Fine Art. And then I was working in New York as an architect and set designer. And then I worked, then I went to GCEP, Columbia University. And then I went to AA, where I met Joseph. And then I recently studied at Strelka Institute in Moscow also. And yeah, after New York, I moved to London, and then from London to Italy. And then from Italy briefly to Moscow, and now back to Italy. Thank you so much for having us. Really glad to be here and talk with you about this project. It's called Non-Extractive Architecture on Designing Without Depletion, and it's an exhibition, research platform, multiple book project. It's a large project, and as you can see, it started in early March and it lasts until next year. So it's over a year-long project, but it's actually been happening for, I would argue, many years before this exhibition and will continue for many years after. So it's not something that we plan to figure out in the coming year or solve anything or reach any sort of final project through this exhibition, but it's the start or in the middle of something, I would argue. This exhibition was planned to open at the last Biennale, which was delayed until this year, and it will open to the press next week as part of the Venice Biennale. So the project is called Non-Extractive Architecture. And you might ask, like, what is non-extractive architecture? What is this term? What does it mean? And I think that's something that we're working to define through the course of this year. But one thing I like to start with is this image from Armin Linke, which is also the cover of our recently published book. And it's an image of the Barcelona Pavilion. And I think in the past, maybe we had looked at this image and thought, beautiful composition, nice piece of rock, beautiful piece of architecture expressing different modernist ideals. It's a beautiful piece of stone, beautiful chairs, but we never really looked at it critically. And I think what the project aims to do is to think about the externalities that are behind this image, like what were the consequences of the removal of the stone? Where did it come from? Who was the person or multiple bodies that cut it? What is now left in its space from this site? And it's really about looking at the invisible side effects of a masterpiece like this and of a lot of our architecture that we produce or that we used to produce. I think it's about looking at all of these unseen consequences of what we build, about labor, about the community's effects, about the materials that go into our architecture, and even decommissioning a building. What happens when the building goes away and where does that material go? Because I think, as we know, buildings and architecture generally create about 40% of the world's carbon dioxide emissions. So I think it's not really a question anymore of like, can we make a sustainable architecture or more efficient architecture? I think that's should be taken for granted. Of course, we have to build sustainably and with green materials, whatever that means, and with solar and with efficient construction materials, but it's way more than that. And I think what non-extractive architecture is demanding or questioning is that how can we think of it even more broadly? Like, we don't want to simplify the question of what non-extractive architecture is or what sustainable is or green is, because I think those terms are too narrow in their scope. But that non-extractive architecture in a way complicates the question more and widens it more and includes things like labor practices and the extraction of bodies in space and the extraction of community practices that are harmful, the extraction of long supply chains and things like this that we need to also include in the way we design. So why it's not switching? Oh, here we go. Okay, so the project is here in Venice, the VAC Foundation. The VAC Foundation is a center for arts. It's based in Moscow, but they also have a second location here in Venice. I would say that it's not really an exhibition. It's more of a project The exhibition is a live research platform with a group of residents here in the space researching case studies towards non-extractive architecture. So they're collecting ideas of different materials, of tools, techniques, policies, community programs, and design strategies that are all working towards what we're calling non-extractive architecture, which simply, or not so simply, means not depleting resources or bodies in the making of our architecture. And it's about also creating a network of people. So we're trying to get sort of a toolbox of people, of ideas, of materials that we can then have travel and continue after this and make a sort of ongoing archive. So this is our sort of core team of Space Caviar that are here in Venice and in front of the Palazzo. So some of the questions that the project asks is, what if architecture was understood first and foremost as a form of husbandry of the built and natural environment? So this is about thinking about the role of the architect itself. I think that's something that we keep saying we need to probably start with redesigning. And I think in a way that comes from redesigning architectural education also. Like, how do we teach architecture? How do we teach what it means to be an architect? Maybe it means not designing any built form anymore. Maybe we don't design buildings as architects, but instead we design systems of care and maintenance. Maybe we design systems of innovation. Maybe we design different ways of creating materials and supply chains and community networks. It's about investigating both the material and social dynamics that are underlying the production of the design environment. I think we want to question really the role of the architect and be more ambitious in what we can do as designers and thinkers and custodians of the built environment, because we feel like this is a role that architects need to start taking some responsibility for, but also thinking of the role of the architect as a much more multidisciplinary field and we're involving economists, photographers, philosophers, material scientists, politicians, policymakers as all part of this conversation, because the role of the architect, if it is going to tackle a topic this big and this complex, will need to be a really diverse group of people that create a sort of network around these ideas. So also, what if we redesigned our economies to favor circularity and social resilience? Because I think in the current scheme of capitalism, a non-extractive architecture is not possible. It's an architecture that is reliant on growth. I think will be really difficult to create something called non-extractive architecture. So we need to kind of shift our thinking and talk with a lot of economists and talk with policymakers around this idea of changing our priorities around, instead of prioritizing short-term well-being, we need to think of the future and sort of a longer now. What if supply chains behind environments we inhabit were visible and participatory? So what if the invisible counter landscapes, like the one from the Barcelona Pavilion sheet of marble that I showed, what if those were made visible? What if the supply chains of where those materials came from were made visible? What if the labor practices that behind those materials were made visible? I think something that we often talk about in this project is, imagine you're building a project in your backyard and suddenly the house that you're going to make needs to come from your surrounding context. So you say, okay, I want to build my house out of concrete. It's going to be any form imaginable and it can be exactly the shape I want. But what if that concrete needs to come from your backyard and a hole needs to be dug in your backyard to get the sand? Suddenly this concrete building is not so interesting anymore to you because you now have a giant pit in your backyard. But what if instead that building was made from a forest in your backyard? Suddenly it becomes more interesting because the trees grow and they provide shade and then they regrow. And I think if we start to shorten the time spans and the distances of the materials that we use, I think as soon as we start thinking of it almost as like a local foods movement of how we source our architecture and think about it much more personally and the way building in our hands and the building of it ourselves and with a community and with materials found in our backyard, suddenly if we reduce these steps and we reduce the invisibility of these distances, I think we could make a much more non-extractive architecture. This is an image from Dan Hill when we were talking to him about the project. He said, that's interesting because like Venice right now, it's a lot of heavy stone buildings on wood piles into the water. It's a city of stone built on trees that are like in the water. And so what you're talking about with this project in a way is like you want to reverse Venice. You want to put the stone back in the ground, keep it in underwater, keep it in the earth, and instead put trees on top. And we're like, yeah, I think in a way it's kind of nice flip. But I mean, it's not so simple as that, of course, as you can imagine. So to start the project, over the past year, we were delayed because of the ongoing pandemic, and we had this year to reflect on what we wanted to do with this exhibition. So we decided to make the year really productive and produce this first volume of the book. And as you can see, it's like largely titled Volume 1 because intentionally this next year, we will be producing Volume 2, and Volume 2 will be an ongoing collection of all the work that happens in the Palazzo with the residency, with all the guests that we bring in to discuss these case studies and research. And all of that research will go into Volume 2. And we'll collect a diverse range of perspectives and ideas and network. And Volume 1 was really about creating a historical and theoretical framework for the research that we wanted to come for this year. And the first volume also featured like a wide range of different voices, from photographer like Armin Linke to historians like Mark Wigley and writers like Keller Easterling, but then also some young voices like Elsa Hoover, who's an indigenous architect looking at mapping different social practices, or Luke Jones. He's a young architect with a collective called Heat Island, which is looking at environment and its relationship to built form. And he's one of our residents, actually. Chiara Di Leone is a young economist. Charlotte Malter-Bartz is doing a really interesting project called Stop Construction and a sort of moratorium on construction. Emmanuel Kocha, he's a philosopher. So there was like a lot of kind of diverse range of voices, not just architects in the book. And that's really important to us in the project. This is a beautiful drawing by Charlotte Malter-Bartz for the book that she did, where it's looking at all the elements that constitute a building and all its materials and where they come from, and sort of tracing a building back to its form. This is Luke Jones, who again is one of the residents here in the project, but also was one of the authors of the first volume. And here he's looking at the flows of carbon between a forest and a building. So this project takes form in several parallel strands. It's a research project in general, but through this we do 2 sets of residencies. So right now there's 5 research residents working here in the space. This is sort of like their open design studio or open design school, where they walk into the space and it's their office. And so as a guest to the exhibition, you're really seeing their studio space. We have different public programs through guests that we're inviting to be part of the book in a way. So by inviting them to give a talk or a lecture, we're including them as part of this ongoing work towards the book. As you can see, the walls of the Palazzo are pieces of paper, and those are all the pages of the book that we hope to publish at the end of this year. And all of the research that's ongoing gets put on the wall, but then also part of this ongoing digital archive that we hope will be a collection of case studies of materials, ideas, techniques, tools, policies that can all be then downloaded and printed and anywhere or looked at online, and be part of this ongoing archive that we'll be working on for years to come. So the Palazzo is really like this open design studio that we hope that, especially once the lockdown is lifted, everyone can come and see this sort of network of ourselves that we're forming, but of other people as well that are coming into the space and adding to this ongoing research. There's a little bit of a delay. Oh, here we go. One of the first things that you'll see when you come into the space is a materials workshop and laboratory that we designed in the entrance of the palazzo. And it's kind of strange because it's a very fancy, beautiful palazzo. And the first thing is this like heavy duty materials workshop. But the real idea is that we really wanted to bring people into the space physically, although it's difficult at this time, and work on testing and modeling these ideas with real materials and bringing material specialists into the palazzo to discuss alternative techniques and alternative materials for building, and produce the tests in real time that will then be displayed as part of the exhibition and be part of like an ongoing material library that we're developing. So in making an exhibition like this, we're faced with the question of like, we don't want to make an exhibition that produces waste. In general, we like to make exhibitions with Space Caviar that are mobile, that are modular, that can be transported really easily, and that can be collectively added to. So this produces exactly that. We started with this idea from this exhibition from the UNESCO Human Rights Exhibition in 1949, where they were sort of faced with a similar problem. They had this new idea at the time, because it was called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that had just been released, and they needed to. So what they did was they produced an album of 110 images with captions on just simple sheets of paper, like what we're doing, that illustrated these moments, seminal moments of what they were calling human rights. At the time, it was like an abstract notion. And so they sent this sort of mobile exhibition around, as well as instructions for its installation. So in a way, we're faced with a similar problem. How do we construct a vocabulary and a series of case studies and examples around the idea of non-extractive architecture? So together with F451, we developed an algorithm that sorts all of the exhibition material and all of the research we're doing onto these sheets of paper and does like all the graphic design. So the researchers can really focus on the research itself and on the conversations they're having with different specialists. And all of this is sort of automated into the archive process. And this is something we developed together with Interiors Agency over the past year. Another exhibition we looked at a lot was This Is Tomorrow in 1956, and sort of this accumulating of images and of references. This is an image of the exhibition format editor, this software that automatically translates the imagery and does all of the translation also for the exhibition, all the captioning, and puts it into the archive. And here you can see us putting up some tests with the images. And this is all printed through a publishing station that was designed together with N55, Ian Sorvin and Till Wolfer. And the publishing station is where we print all of the documents of research with the pieces of paper. Pieces of paper are actually made with an invasive species of algae that grows around the palazzo, and then are turned into these pieces of paper. So they look like blank sheets of paper all over the palazzo, but they're actually made from seaweeds. Another way we communicate the research is through a broadcast station that we also made with XYZ Cargo. And this is, we have like these three ways of sharing the information. And these are vehicles, they're bicycles that are meant to travel also outside of the palazzo and after the palazzo exhibition. And so this exhibition can really travel and share its knowledge in the future. And also go outside in front of the palazzo. This is where the residents can do interviews with guests, and these interview series will be part of the second book as well. Then we have the library, which is an ongoing archive of essential texts that we've curated around the topic of non-extractive architecture and that are being used by the residents during their research. And also we feel it can be like a time capsule, a capsule of knowledge that can then be sent to different exhibitions or different schools or different government agencies, community centers, and can be used to also producing information and case studies for the ongoing archive of non-extractive architecture. we really see this project is something, like I said, will be growing over the years. So we wanted these vehicles to be able to support whoever wants to do this project. Maybe your school wants to also be part of this project and produce some case studies and knowledge towards this ongoing archive. So these are some more images. Here's volume 1 on the shelves, and hopefully by the end of the year we'll have both volume 1 and volume 2, and then who knows, maybe 3, 4. The vehicles are in a way like sort of these capsules that you send outer space that help to transport the research and the ideas. And we're also making these filing cabinets that will be a system of housing all of the papers afterwards that then can also be sent to a physical archive of all of the research. But there will be also the online archive and also volume 2. So as volume 1 was the sort of theoretical basis of the book, of the project, volume 2 will be a handbook more of all of these case studies, tools, materials, policies, different people. And hopefully at the end of the book, we're even hoping to have like a contact list of like email addresses, phone numbers, websites, and things that you can find. So the book really becomes a tool as well. I think that's something in general with Space Caviar we like to do with our exhibitions, is to make tools to make more exhibitions. So in a way, it's an exhibition and it's a book, hopefully, that produces a lot more architecture and a lot more exhibitions, just with a smaller footprint on the planet. Yeah, so that's it. Now we can maybe open it up for conversation.
Hi, Sophia. Yeah, that was great. Thank you very much. Can you hear us okay? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that was really kind of interesting. Thanks so much for the talk. And I mean, I kind of, for both personal and kind of the posed intellectual reasons, I quite like the idea of trying to cycle the one of the vehicles around around Venice, particularly the documentation.
Yeah.
Bicycle. I mean, there's probably a kind of performance in itself, isn't there? Just trying to maneuver
Totally.
the object.
Well, they're really easy to ride, actually. This group, XYZ Cargo, has designed this beautiful system. We actually found them through this other really cool project called Low Tech Magazine, which is a solar-powered website. And they had written about their work, and then we contacted them, and they've been really wonderful to work with. And the bikes are great. They're all designed on like a standard shipping container. So like the size of the transport dictated the size of the bicycles, which is really nice. So they're really meant to be shared and to travel. And I really like that. And they're all flat pack. They can shrink down to a small size.
I mean, there's quite a lot in the, there's quite a lot in the talk where you, you know, and yet you did actually mention at one point about designing systems, but, you know, because of the kind of manifesto, if you like, of the exhibition, it's kind of really implicit in it that it has to also act in the spirit of the exhibition, doesn't it? So have those systems or mechanics been almost more important than the object nature of the outcomes of the mechanics in a way?
Yeah. I mean, so much of this exhibition is the design of this tool, of the formatting tool and the archive. So like, how do we organize information? How do we organize big sets of information that are going to grow? How do we tag things? How do we keep track of different topics? And sorry, I just saw a question. I'll answer in a minute. And how do we, it's about like sorting information and making a database that can grow over the coming years and doesn't become outdated or doesn't become too difficult to use. So instead of making a really flashy exhibition right now, we've been really focused on making this tool work for all the research residents, because we've learned so many things through actually using the tool. And so now we're adjusting things, and but definitely you just asked like, how can we contribute to this? Where I can share with you the tool that we're using to make the case studies. I'll put it in the chat. Basically, you can, right now, it's not working yet that it will go automatically to the archive, but if you email me your research, I can put it into the archive. It's part of this ongoing database of case studies. So we're looking at case studies of materials, policies, network of individuals, design. I'll just write it in the tool in the chat so you have it. Design strategies, economic platforms, community context, and towards non-extractive architecture. And so if you make a case study with the tool, you can send it to us. It makes this sort of PDF, and you can just send me the PDF of your work or of work that you find interesting. And it can be potentially added to the book and definitely added to the exhibition and to the ongoing archive. The book will collect all of the research that the residents are doing, that even you guys might do, and that guests are doing. We've invited, like, there will be over 100 people that come into Venice to contribute as part of this ongoing lecture series and conferences, and all of those transcripts will also become part of the book and interviews that happen in the space. You mentioned the paper that you printed. Yes, the paper that was used, all the paper from algae is used as the cover of the book, and the inside of the book is made from recycled paper. It's not the algae paper, but the cover is the algae paper. You spoke. Sorry, I'm just reading.
It's okay.
Yes, I really think that in terms of education, I think the role of architectural education, my personal background is one of a really multidisciplinary approach to architecture. I studied first fine arts at a, what they call, what is it called? In the US, you go to these liberal arts schools. So it means that you sort of study everything. It's not like you don't go there and you study art or philosophy or economics. You take courses in all different topics. So that was my undergraduate experience. And my focus was on fine art. And I did my thesis about, like, the inside of a wall. So I was, of course, already really interested in architecture. But then I went on to study at the Architectural Association, where they also really see architecture as a sort of expansive way of studying, where some people are studying more parametric design, others are doing really hand-based craft work, others are, so there's a wide range of aesthetics for sure, but also there at the school you can say that this, for my project, I want to make a film as my thesis, or my project, I want to make one single drawing as my thesis, or I want to make an essay as my thesis. And there's a lot of different ways and materials of becoming an architect there, which I really appreciated. But I think that it needs to be pushed even further. I think that as architects, we should maybe be teaching architecture less based on the form and the aesthetic of a building, but more around the sort of externalities that I talked about that go into making an architecture. So if I were running a studio, I would encourage my students to think of, or myself in my own practice in the buildings that we're making, to really think about the materials and where they come from and how close they come from and what happens to the building afterwards and how long the life cycle of that building is and who's going to build it, and the sort of labor practices behind the building and the politics around the building, that speaking with communities. I think this is a much bigger part of design. It's often not part of the architect's role. A project that we're working on with Space Caviar right now is on a very remote island where there's no roads to the building site and there's no sort of infrastructure and there's no material relation. Like, it's really difficult to get wood on the island, for example. And right now, the only things built on the island are made from concrete, which is the worst material for the island for many reasons. But in another way, like, there's no way to get a concrete truck to the site because there's no road. So we've been experimenting a lot with different like zip line systems from the ocean to the site, thinking about developing our own material on location, creating a sort of material economy for the island that would create jobs and create a sort of network of people working towards a different material future, creating a research residency of people all working to make the building together and things like this. And I think for me, that's a much more interesting way of thinking about architecture, is thinking about all the things that happen behind the building. So linked to Finley question. Again, yeah, I think that the role of architectural humanities will be a much more collaborative one. I don't think in the future of architecture it will matter so much what the shape or size or look of your building, but more about talking with communities about restoring an existing project. I think in a way we've sort of reached the limit for the world of what we can build anymore. I think we should question a lot. I think if your professor, I don't know if Paul is your professor, but if he asks you to design a new housing project, I think one of the first questions you could give back is like, why? Like, do we need it anymore? And maybe your project could then propose to take over a building that's disused and translate those materials and renovate or demolish and grind up that building and turn it into a new building. A lot of things we're talking about in this project are like things like material passports, which catalog all of the materials that go into a building so that it can be dismantled and reused in the future, or things like modular designs that allow for multiple lives of a building. And that already program the reuse of a building in the future. But I think in general, architecture and the way it's taught, we need to think of it really no longer as a singular role. Like, I don't know how it works in your school, but at least at the AA, everyone does their project on their own, right? And there's still this sort of vision of the master architect, and the architect is this sort of heroic figure and singular, brilliant mind. And I'm sorry, but architecture doesn't happen like that in the real world. Like, if you're building a project or a building, it's a huge amount of people that go into making any project happen. All of this sort of star architect syndrome, I think, should go away and won't be the future of architecture, because it's just really not how architecture happens. And it's also not how we should study it, because I think it's always a collaborative project, right? Whenever you make a building, it's something you deal with contractors and construction workers and the client, and then the city board, and then the material supplier, and there's so many people involved. And I think that the more we can teach architecture in this way as a real collaborative action, and with the struggle and the sort of conflict that happens in these conversations when you are forced to work together with hundreds of people or 40 people, I think that's the way we should learn architecture, because that's the way it's practiced also. If we teach architecture as this sort of like, only I'm the architect, and it's not a diverse discipline, and it's only like someone that designs built forms, I just don't think that makes sense anymore for the future of architecture, because in a way we can't really build like that anymore. We've reached our limit.
I mean, it's an interesting idea, isn't it? And I know that one of the collaborators in your book mentioned, I think I made a wee note of it, it's like one of them was talking about a moratorium on building. Charlotte. Yeah, and it's an interesting idea that certainly either regionally, nationally, or globally, there could be lines drawn, couldn't there, about capacity in terms of material banks, and then capacity in terms of necessity, you know, and that a kind of line could be drawn somewhere. I mean, one of the things you talked about there in terms of, you know, asking the question, we do have a we have interior architecture course in the school that solely looks at the reuse of existing buildings, but our architecture course also looks at that, and it's something we've always looked at because it's part of the kind of fabric of, in the UK in particular, you know, which has a, you know, a kind of ideological connection to existing buildings that are based in culture and history, not in terms of climate crisis, has always had kind of attitude about existing buildings. But what's really interesting is the kind of the definition of value in an existing building, and that's interesting because, as I say, in the UK it's always been about, you know, stylization, or somebody was born there, or somebody wrote their first novel in a building, or you know, and it's connected to culture in some way, when actually if you start thinking about existing buildings as extant matter, you know, why build out of newly fabricated matter when that matter's around? I mean, do you think that, you know, projects like Super Uses, Harvest Map and stuff that looks at trying to create a database of materials, is that something that you hope your project can also do?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's exactly what we're trying to do, like, is to create a database of tools and ideas and people that are doing things similar. Like, for sure, non-extractive architecture is not our idea. We don't claim. We're just trying to gather as many of these great ideas and as many of these people together. So there's this sort of handbook of a future way of building that we can all look to. And this handbook should grow, and it should be both a physical archive and online. Finley had a question kind of related, that often there's a misunderstanding that eco is expensive, and how would you say it's an effective way to convince people? I think that, I mean, one of the first things you can say, which is not always helpful, but is that how do we value, what do we put value on? Because if we're talking about expensive, then like, I think like our future generations' lives, like, you know, how do you put a value on that? But often I think that the current economic framework that we live within, the sort of short-term benefit is always appreciated, or it drives a lot of design decisions. But I think, at least working in Italy, there is a lot of like government put incentives for building with solar, or for building with CLT, that are really encouraging to start seeing. But I think, again, there needs to be a much larger shift, things like carbon credits and things like this. It's just the beginning, but I think there needs to be like a real fundamental shift in the way we think about economy and the environment. And I think that's a much bigger question, and it needs to come from, again, the role of the architect becoming also a mediator and being in conversation with economists and policymakers and people that have the power to make these big decisions, but also demanding as an architect and saying like, oh, no, I only work with these materials, and if you want my interesting design and my input, then this is how I work. Like, we're working now. The past year, we got several commissions for houses, and we've started working on them. But they're all we're all doing them using CLT that's locally produced, and it's just it hasn't even become a conversation with the client. It's just like, this is what we're doing, and if you like it, sure. If not, we would rather lose the project, because it's interesting for us to build right now with a different material, and this is what we want to experiment with. So I think it's also about also standing up for how you want to build. And I don't know if it's possible to convince people, but it's also nice to work with clients that understand, and to find a client that I think it's going to be a long conversation, but hopefully it's one that we can start to have more and more.
Yeah, I mean, but you do need those kind of positional moments, don't you, that define an approach. And sometimes, there's two ways it can be done. It can be done in that way where you say, well, this is the only way we'll work. And then there are other practices that are trying to educate the client during the process, isn't it, as well?
Yeah, I think it's a combination. I think it's, it's not like this is it. No, it's of course a conversation, explain why. It's also, for the most part, once you do the math, it becomes either the same price or slightly more, but there's so many benefits. Like the amount of maintenance is much less, the amount of heating is much better, the loss of the dampness is better. Like suddenly you start to show all of the money they're going to save through heating, through renovations, through the money that they're going to get back from the solar. And suddenly it makes sense. Once people start to think long-term, I think that's the difference, is that we need to stop thinking about the sort of short-term growth incentives, but think about really the long now and also future generations. But as soon as you start doing that, I think the math even makes sense.
Yeah, and I think, like anything, if you're trying to, if you've got someone that has the same ideological view as you, then the kind of cost, if you like, is less of an issue. If you can demonstrate its value through its cost benefits, then you've got developers' attention, haven't you?
Right. So, but all of these things are just about, like, there's a moment where everything will flip, right? If enough people start using CLT, or if enough people start using solar, then it's going to become really cheap. It's just about hitting that sort of mass amount of use, and then of course the financial model will shift again.
Yeah, well, there's been quite a bit in the press lately about certainly in the UK. It's been in most even in sort of broadsheet newspapers about what's claimed to be the first 3D printed house in the Netherlands, and it feels like construction technology is emerging perhaps at the time when it's starting to be able to do the things we'd maybe want it to do the least in terms of climate crisis. And there's I just wonder what your views are on that tension, sort of technological advancement, and as I say, perhaps at the worst time for it to happen, that we'd have robots pouring plastics and concretes everywhere.
Well, I guess it's what you do with the robots, right? So actually, we're working together with WASP 3D. They're a company here in Italy, and they're part of the exhibition. And what WASP does is they're experimenting with earth printing. So they're sort of using this vernacular technique of building earth houses, but with robots. And it's actually really amazing what they can develop. And we are going to get one of their 3D printers here in Venice, and we're working with IAC School in Barcelona. They have a educational master's on studying earth and 3D printing, and it's really amazing the sort of shapes and forms that they can construct that are really linked to its material efficiency and to heating and window openings. And we find it really quite exciting, and we're actually going to be working with them on several different projects to try and understand, like, how, I think with this project, a lot of misconceptions often happen, that people think, oh, non-extractive architecture, this is a sort of call for a return to the vernacular or only local movement. But it's really not the case. I mean, I think one of the ways that we see non-extractive architecture happening is through a sort of smaller supply chain and local construction with people and materials in a short distance. But another is through the use of technologies, including robotics, that can help alleviate exploitative labor practices, that could really allow for things like earth to be printed in an efficient way. So I think the problem with often the 3D printing robots is that they've been using concrete, but maybe if they start using other things. We also talked a lot with IAC And they showed us some of the experiments they're doing with the robots and building with wood, and how the robots can like sense and choose which tree is the best one in terms of its health, in terms of its form to cut down and save a lot of like unnecessarily deforestation and things like that. So I think technology is for sure maybe one of the answers. It's just more about asking what is the question, right? So like, what is the question you want to solve, and what is the kind of architecture you want to make, and then finding the technology that's right for.
Yeah, I was just looking at the WASP's website there. Actually, it looks kind of really interesting. It's quite an interesting kind of partnership as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, something you also said about, because there's often the talk about the kind of material resources, but the kind of unspoken, or often unspoken, which you've mentioned a few times, is the kind of, for us not to, making architecture should not deplete resources or bodies. Yeah. And, that's something that the West in particular has never really, it's always been this skeleton in the closet of the West that, it often will take, stone from China or because it's cheaper, and not worry about how the stone was excavated or got to the site, And
we definitely, we just don't even realize that it just arrives, so no one thinks about the sort of background story of it.
And it's trying to get that, that idea that it's not just it's not just materials, but there's a whole range of kind of depletions that take place, isn't there? Sorry, Finley's written an essay here. As an extension of his previous statement.
I'm reading now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a case-by-case basis, but I think that we should stop compromising in a way. I think we should just be more ambitious with the way we design. I mean, I think architects are like these sort of superhumans, right? You're all doing these projects where you give up your body and your mind and your many sleepless nights to these projects. And if we turn this energy into something that, I think it's not so difficult to find good materials and good supply chains together. There's so many people looking for work. There's so many interesting material speculation and ideas. Like, we started this project just a few months ago, and the Palazzo was already covered in case studies and ideas and people working towards this. So it's really, I think we don't have an excuse or a reason not to work in this way anymore. I don't even see an alternative. I just think if I'm going to build a building, I'm not going to bring the material from China. Why? Because I have material 100 meters away. If I don't have a material 100 meters away, maybe I should question if I should make the building there, right? If I don't have people that I can work with in a non-competitive way, maybe I should find a way to crowdsource for the money to build this project. I don't want to hire people and do some sort of modern day slavery or have people working in poor conditions. I just think we should demand, no, like it can't happen anymore. So what are the alternatives? And I think this project is working to create a sort of handbook of all of these alternatives. We can't compromise anymore. I think that should be your answer, that we can't, it's simply possible. And I think especially one great thing that I would encourage you all to do is to take part in some design make projects where you actually build some of your ideas yourself and physically feel what it means to build a building, because I think that will really shape you as designers and make you think about the consequences and the physical weight of a building that you design. Because as soon as we remove these sort of externalities and take it out of AutoCAD and take it out of Rhino, you'll see like how big a building is, how much a window weighs, how much a brick weighs, and it will change the way you design, I guarantee, because you'll think about the hands and the bodies that have to lift that. And maybe then you'll call in the robots and they can do it. There's always an alternative, right?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Actually, I mean, you know, the more that students can, you know, get their hands dirty in that respect, the better. For all kinds of reasons, notwithstanding the ones you've mentioned, but also just about the translation of the line to the object is really important, isn't it? You know, really important. Just if I can just sort of go back a little bit to, if I can ask a question or two about the exhibition, because, you know, in the world of design and making buildings, making spaces, it's always definitive and finite, isn't it? You get a brief that has a deadline and an outcome. Yet you've set yourselves a kind of exhibition that, in a way, just asks questions, but it doesn't know about itself. You know, it doesn't know what it will become. It doesn't know when its end is. So there's a real element of the not knowing, you know, and there's excitement and risk in that, isn't there? That you would start something and it becomes itself, and you may have to, I don't know, you may, like a parent, you may have to let it go, you know, at some point. I mean, how does that project come about, and what does that feel like? Is it exciting, anxious?
No, like I said, this is a project that we've been working on for years, right? So I think in a way, all of our projects in the studio are connected to this one. In a lot of ways, through the buildings that we're designing, through the other exhibitions that we're doing, through the other books that we're doing, they're all connected. So it doesn't feel overwhelming in that way. But there's also, of course, this feeling of the Biennale is opening next week. And the one problem of doing an exhibition in this way is that you're never done, right? So there's never this moment of rest and relief and like, we put the last thing on the wall, the exhibition is finished, we can all sleep well now. Like, this is always going to be added to and always ongoing, and always more people we want to involve, and always more conversations to be had. But I think that's also really exciting. And I hope that also you guys will take part in this somehow, and maybe even the vehicles can come to you and you can do a workshop connected to this exhibition. The idea is that this is really, I don't think there will ever be an end to this, right? I think that this project is something that I'll work my whole life on, alongside of all my other projects, because this is the kind of way I want to build. And this is the kind of way I want to involve with other people to build. So I think that this is an archive that will continue for, on wood, I don't know, the next, 50, 60 years that I'm alive, I hope, and more, and for many years after that. So it's a very long now, I would say. It's a project that has a super long timeline, just as I think a lot of the architecture we make, we need to think about its long timeline and how long it's going to exist on the planet. So yeah, this is just the beginning. We're kind of in the middle of it, and hopefully there will be like 100 volumes of this book, but the next one will be volume 2 coming out in the spring, and the first one just came out a few months ago, and you can find it online or maybe in your bookshop already. But yeah, stay tuned. Come see us in Venice.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thanks for doing that. I was just about to sort of dig out the web address and post that. Yeah, I mean, you know, it's really interesting. I'd be more than interested in the school participating, whether it's, you know, as a kind of school initiative or whether it's individual studios or even individual students. I mean, I think what's really interesting about this project is its openness, you know, and so I would encourage all of our students to check out your exhibition in more detail, and the links that you've put in respect of the platform. But yeah, it would be really interesting to keep in touch and keep an eye on the exhibition, and who knows, I mean, certainly next semester or the start of, you know, the next academic year, September, October, just before the Biennale closes, we'll definitely be, I would expect, able to travel, if not sooner. So yeah, hopefully either all of us or some of us can get to Venice soon to see the exhibition. yeah, we'll try and keep in touch and take you up on some of those offers about involvement. That'd be really, really good. Thanks so much for the talk. It was really interesting, and in particular the really open kind of questions and the enthusiasm for, you know, this kind of campaign for, you know, like start to look after ourselves a little bit better.
I mean, don't feel like the world is on your shoulders. I think the point of this project and the point of what I think being an architect today is that, again, it's a collaborative project. It should be across multiple disciplines and with hundreds of people being part of this. So don't think of yourself as the sort of individual architect that has to save the world. Find friends that think the same as you. Find a community. You already have a great community being part of your school. Gather a network and form a sort of body of people that can hook up with other bodies of people and take over the world. So it's not all on your shoulders. It's a big group effort.